Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are still in day 10. In earlier lecture, you understood about encryption, decryption, signature, certificate. If you have not seen my previous lecture, go to my playlist, see the description. You'll get to know the playlist details and go through the previous video. So, now in this lecture, I'm going to discuss about OAuth2 in detail. And also we'll understand about one interesting thing called as JWT. So when understanding about JWT, you will see a practical usage of signature. A beautiful concept. I'm going to explain you with examples. Okay. So even though you know about OAuth already, please look at it. Your perspective will change, and also the thought process, of course, will change. So fine, let us talk with a scenario. Assume that I am developing my website and I want users to sign up with my website so that I can actually do some business on the website. So users, of course, I can give a sign up page and let users sign up. But as a user, how many usernames and passwords will this user remember? He might have account in multiple websites like mine. How many users and passwords does he remember? He might have got frustrated. Of course, you might have got frustrated to remember all the usernames and passwords, right? Will it not be good if you can log into my website using your Google account? You might be having, most of you might be having Google account, right? So it is nowadays easy to log into many websites using Google. So I just remember my Google username and password, and I using my Google account, I'll be able to log into multiple websites. Um, for example, let me go to Quora.com, just one website. See, it allows me to either log in with Google account or Facebook account. Right. So it is good. I can easily log in with my Google account. So I don't. I just need to remember only one username and password. Fine. So now let us come to sign up. Or even before that, as a user, if you are having Google account, in Google you have your photos, you have your Google Docs, you have your Google Drive, and a lot of other things. Google provides a lot of other apps also, right? Using your Google account, you'll be able to retrieve or upload photos, retrieve or upload docs, retrieve or upload into Google Drive, etc. So, if somebody knows your Google username and password, they will be able to access all of your resources. Okay. Now, let's coming to our website. If I want a user to log into my website using his Google credentials, suppose if my website asks, give me your Google ID and Google password, will you be comfortable to give your Google ID and password? No, right? Suppose if you give your original Google ID and Google password, this website can store them in its database and it can get full access to your Google account. No, you don't want to do it. Actually, if my website wants this user details, can it fetch by making an API call to Google? Yes. Actually, as a user, whenever you're signing up, you might have given all of your information to Google, like what is your full name, phone number, email ID, your profile pic also you might have uploaded on Google, etc. So you have all the information. You have given all of your information. Even you have given your date of birth to Google. Now, whenever I'm building my website. If I want a user to sign up, I might want a few details like what is his full name, what is his email, phone number, and maybe I want profile pic also. And maybe my website also wants a date of birth from Google, your date of birth, so that my website can send you some personalized offers on your birthday. So let's assume that my website wants all these details while signing up. But as a user, you have given all these details to Google. And if my website can fetch all those details, then it is equivalent to sign up, right? Okay. And even while signing in also, if it can get the email ID used from Google, it can let you sign in, right? So actually what I want is, suppose I am, suppose you are a user. As a user, you are not comfortable to give your original Google ID and password because I will get full access. But what this user wants is, user wants to grant, I'm using a word, grant, partial authorities, partial authorities, so that this application, web application, can fetch only few details like name, email. I might not want to give permission to get my date of birth. So basically, I want a way to grant partial authorities to my Google account, so that to whom I want to grant, to this website, to this app, I want to grant partial authorities so that this web application can actually fetch my details on my behalf. If this website can get it, it can actually let me sign up or sign in, right? So basically, OAuth is used for granting partial authorities to your account on some authentication server or authorization server, we say auth server. So in Google, they have their own authorization server implementing a specification called as OAuth. Actually, OAuth is a specification and OAuth2 is the latest version. So Google is actually having a server implementing this OAuth specification. We call it as OAuth server. Why this specification? Actually, suppose tomorrow if I want to integrate with Facebook instead of Google, I want my website to log in. I want users of my website to log in using their Facebook. The procedure to do will should be similar, right? So if Facebook also is following OAuth and Facebook has its own authorization server implementing OAuth specification, the integrating with website will be similar. So OAuth is a specification and there are multiple authorization servers implementing OAuth. Okay, you might have got some idea by whatever I discussed, but you might not have got confidence. So let me tell you the entire end-to-end flow, how a website can allow a sign-in through Google. Right now, I'm showing an example of Google, but later I'll go into real scenario within our organizations. So let us start with a scenario. In OAuth, there are four actors. One is an authorization server, or we call it as auth server. Actually, another actor in OAuth is we call it as resource owner. Why do we call this user as a resource owner? For example, let's assume that this is Google authorization server, and in Google, this user has his photos, docs, etc. Actually, photos. are some resources of this user. Docs are some resources of this user. So this user is owning some resources on Google. So that is the reason why we call him as resource owner. Now, what this resource owner wants to do, as he is having multiple resources on Google, he don't want to give full access. He wants to give partial access, partial authorization, only for maybe photos. He don't want to give access for docs, right? So resource owner is another actor. And another thing is resource server. Resource servers, I will say, or server. Actually, this photos, there might be a Google API called as Photos API to retrieve photos. There might be an API, Google API, to retrieve docs. So there might be some servers who are actually exposing the APIs to retrieve photos, another API to retrieve docs. These APIs are hosted on their own resource servers. Basically, you can call these APIs as resources and the servers where they are hosted as resource servers. So this is the third actor. And the fourth actor is a client application. So there are four actors. Let us see the integration among all of them. Okay. So this is my either a web application or a mobile application, anything. So this client wants to actually have access to the resource owner's resources, right? So why are we calling it as a client? Suppose if I am developing my own website, and if I want my website to actually use Google authorization server, first thing what I need to do is I need to go and register with Google as a client. My web application, I have to register my web application or a mobile application as a client with Google so that Google will be able to identify your website or a mobile app. So once registration is done, client registration is done, client will be given a unique client ID and client secret. So every client will have a unique client ID and secret given by the authorization server, Google in this case. Now, once I have got the client ID and secret, what I have done is assume in my website, I have added login with Google button. So user clicks on login with Google. That is the first step. Login with Google. Okay. Now what this web application can do is actually whenever user clicks on login with Google, it will redirect to Google and Google redirect the Google to authorization page. So second step is redirect to a URL called as /authorize, or we call it as an authorization endpoint. So my web application is redirecting to /authorize on Google, right? So the browser, through browser, we are actually redirected to /authorize. But to authorize this user, to give authorization, the Google needs to know who is the user, right? So actually, first of all, while redirecting, the Google should know authorization is for which website. So whenever my website is redirecting to /authorize, my website will send its client ID. client ID is equals to whatever. And also one more thing called as scopes. Actually, what is a scope? Scope is a permission. You can think of it like a permission. I will give you more clarity on the terminology going on, but as of now, think of scope as a permission. So assume that this website wants the permissions to read email. This read email, assume that it is a permission of this on this authorization server, comma, read profile, read, for example, date of birth. Okay. So whatever permissions this website wants, for every permission, there will be a permission name defined by authorization server. All comma separated scopes, it will be sent as part of query parameter. So now when this authorization request goes to authorization server, it will understand, oh, I have to authorize and give these permissions to this website. But to understand who is this user, it wants the user to log in, right? So the third step is actually a login page is shown to resource owner. Third step is show login page. I will write show login page. So now Google, it will show the login page because Google needs to know who is the user. So now fourth step, actually, let me just show the fourth step from here itself. Yeah, from here, the fourth step, user submits credentials. Fourth step, user submits credentials to Google. See, he is not submitting credentials to my website. Google to user is submitting his credentials to Google only. Assume that the credentials are correct. No. Actually, Google needs to give these permissions, right? Read date of birth, read profile, etc. So Google will ask me, the first time Google will show a consent page. So fifth step is Google will show consent page. Consent. That means Google will ask, hey, this website is asking for these permissions, read email, read profile, read date of birth, etc. Do you want to give? Actually, whenever scopes are requested, some scopes might be mandatory or required scopes, and some scopes can be defined as optional. So assume that date of birth is optional scope. Okay, in Google only they will be defining the scopes as optional. So assume that, sorry, not Google, in client they might have configured that this read of date of birth is optional. So the consent page will show, do you want to give a permission for email, profile, and read date of birth? So assume that this resource owner doesn't want to give permission to date of birth. So he will select, I will give permission to read email and read profile and submit. Okay, now the Google understands, oh, I have to give permission only for read email and read profile, not to date of birth. So it will store in its database. Okay, the consent has been given by this user for this client, right? It will store it in its database. Now, the Google will generate a unique authorization code. We call it as auth code. Okay. And it will store that auth code against these details in database. Now Google, what it will do? It will redirect the browser to the client application, and in this redirect there will be a auth code. So sixth step is redirect to client application with auth code, with authorization code. Okay. Now the web application has got authorization code on a URL, right? Now what this client can do is, hey, authorization code will not be sufficient to get access to this resource server APIs. So now what the client will do is, client, again I will write in a different application, different page, client with server, resource server, and resource one. Okay. So now the client has got auth code. Using this auth code, the client will make a request to authorization server to an endpoint called as token endpoint. And in this request, it will pass its client ID, client secret, and also auth code and request for something called as access token. So using this authorization code, client ID, and secret, it will make a request to authorization server. Who? The web application, the client. So now the authorization server, what it will do? It can look in its database. In its database, it has stored this authorization code, right? It will check against this authorization code what all permissions are granted. Then the authorization server will generate and give something called as access token to the client. Okay. This token, we'll discuss about this token. Okay. The client has got this token. Now, this token can be of two types. Access token will be of two types. One is opaque tokens and another is JWT token. We'll understand about JWT next, but let us assume that this token is opaque token. So the token, opaque token, as the name says, that does not have any information. Okay. It is just some random string that will be given to the client. Suppose if this authorization server is sending an opaque token. So what actually authorization server will do is it will store in its database the details about this access token granted. Okay. Now the client has got it, right? Now what the client can do, client can hit the resource server of Google, which can give the profile of the user, email of the user, etc. So the client is making an API call to this resource server to get profile, email, etc. With this resource server, if it gets a request directly without a token, it will reject it. This resource server is secured actually. So to access anything from the resource server, we need a token. So already my client has got a token, right? So whenever client is making an API call, it will send the token, access token. So now the resource server has got the token. What the resource server can do, it can actually hit the authorization server and check if this access token is valid or not. If the access token is valid, what all scopes are granted, okay, it will get. The resource server can hit the authorization server and get the details whether this access token is valid. If it is valid, for this token, what all permissions are granted. So in our earlier scenario, we understood that user gave consent only to read email and read profile. So in this case, the authorization server will send information saying that this token is granted with read profile and also read email, but not read date of birth. So if a request comes to the API to retrieve profile and email, that's fine. The resource server understood that the token is having these permissions, so resource server will return. But if the client is trying to hit the API to retrieve the database, date of birth, there is no permission, right? The resource server can deny. Okay. So in this case, this client has got partial authorities only to retrieve email and profile, but not for reading other details like date of birth. So as a resource owner, I was able to grant partial authorities to this client using OAuth, right? Now this client has got the email and profile, right? Using that details, a client application can log the user in. Basically, this web application, what it needs to let the user log in, email ID and the name. What are the basic details? So using those details, the user will be logged into the client application. So here the concept is the resource owner is having his resources on Google. Instead of giving the full access to his Google account, the user is able to give partial authorities to this web application. That is the concept. Actually, the request is actually dancing between the client, resource server, authorization server, etc. Right? This is called as OAuth dance. Okay. So it is very clumsy. Now you understood at a high level. Now let me put this interaction between authorization server, client, everything step by step. Actually, I am drawing the diagrams so that you will get time to absorb into it. Actually, I should have shown a diagram and I should have discussed it. But if I am drawing and talking, actually, I guess I feel like you'll get more time to absorb. See, the concepts are very important. If you can absorb the core, you'll be able to remember it in a better way, right? So that is the reason I am drawing it. Let me draw it again. Your concepts will become clear. Whatever I have told you, again, I'm going to repeat with a new diagram. So there are four actors. First is the resource owner. Okay. Then is the client application. Then is authorization server. Then resource server. Basically, resource server is nothing but our APIs, Google APIs in this case, for example. Okay, this is Google authorization server, and this is my web application. Okay, so what is the first step? Let me show you the interaction step by step. What is the first step? Click on login button. Okay. Second step, what it will do, the client web application, it will redirect to Google authorization server. So second step is redirect. Who will redirect? Web application is redirect to authorization endpoint to, I'll say something like /authorize. But while sending an authorization request, the Google should know this authorization request is for which client. So a client ID will be sent. It's secret. Only client ID will be sent in this redirect. And scopes, what all permissions, they will be sent as query parameters, scopes. read profile, for example, comma, read email, etc. Okay. So now Google has to authorize. But Google should know who is the user who wants to give authority. So third step, the resource owner will be prompted with login page. So the Google will show login page. That is the third step. Fourth step is resource owner submits credentials. Okay. Then assume that credentials are correct. Now the Google has to get the consent of this owner to grant permissions for reading profile and reading email or etc. So the Google now what it will do once if credentials are correct, Google will show consent page. Show consent page. It will ask for the user consent. You might have seen, right? Whenever you are logging into any website using Google, it might have asked you some permissions, right? Okay. So assume that among all the scopes or permissions requested, let's assume that scope is read date of birth also is there, which is optional scope. But user selected only read email and read profile. That means he is showing his consent to actually give permissions to read profile and read email and not read a date of birth. So in the consent page, assume that user selects to show the consent to authorization server to give permissions. Okay. Now this is 6 steps. Accepting the consent, give consent. Once consent is given, what authorization server will do? Authorization server will store the data in database and it will generate an authorization code. Then the authorization server will redirect the user to the redirect URL. There will be a redirect URL, redirect to client. 7th step is redirect to client with auth code, authorization code which is generated. So client application has got the authorization code. Actually, the client cannot make a request to the resource server using this authorization code. What the client needs is an access token. So what this client will do now, 8th step, again, it will make a request to get / token. Actually, this is the token endpoint. But while making a request to get token, it will send client ID, client secret. Every client will have a client secret, right? And also the auth code. So the server will generate an authorization and will verify this authorization code. And it understands for this authorization code what all permissions have been granted. And this Google is going to generate an access token. So 9th step will be to return access token. As I told you, this access token can be of 2 types: opaque token, JWT token. Opaque token is just a random string which does not contain any information. Okay. So then now what my website will do is the client, it will make a request. Once it gets got access token, my website or the client needs the user profile, etc. Right. So 10th step is retrieve something like profile, email, etc. We are making API calls to resource server. Your resource server is secured, right? But whenever they're retrieving the resource server is secured, it will check if there is access token. So the web application will send access token. Okay, now the resource server has got access token. What it will do, it will validate the resource token with authorization server and get the details about the access token. That means what all permissions it has. So in this case, access token, it says that the permission is there for reading profile and reading email. So the resource server gives the response. Okay. So in this case, I want you to understand, whenever resource server gets the request, it will also get the access token. Now the resource server is using the access token to hit the authorization server and ask, hey, authorization server, is this access token valid? If yes, what all permissions? So the authorization server will return the details, right? Then my client has got all the details like email, profile, etc. The client application will let the user log in. This is the procedure. So basically in this procedure, what the resource owner has done, it has granted partial authority to this web application so that it can retrieve my profile details. So that is the purpose of OAuth, right? So these all steps involved is called as OAuth dance. And in OAuth, there are different ways to get grants. OAuth server, in OAuth, authorization server will grant the permissions, right? There are different kinds of grants. The one which we have seen is authorization code grant. The grant is given by authorization server based on the authorization code. Here, authorization code was there, right? Based on the authorization code, the token was generated. So this flow in authorization server is called as authorization code grant type. So basically, authorization server will grant, right? This is a way to grant. Now, let us talk about a scenario where there is no user involved. There is application A and there is an API. Now, this application wants to consume the API. Server to server, right? Application to application. There is no user involved. Now, this is an API. We want to grant permissions to this application A. So what? This application A is a client, right? It will have its own client ID and secret, client secret. Now, in this case, the authorization server, what it can do, actually, this application can send only the client ID secret to the authorization server and ask for a token. Okay, because there is no user involved, right? So this application can send client ID and secret and ask for token. The authorization server can give if the client ID and secret are valid. Then this token can be used for API access. So in this case, this grant type is called as client credentials grant type. So mostly whenever our applications want to internally get access to the APIs, application to application, we use this grant type. When you are having a user logging in through a website, then we use authorization code grant. But API to API or application to application, mostly we will use client credentials grant type. Okay. So now you understood there are other types of grant types also. Mostly we will be using this. We will not see the others which are not relevant. Mostly we'll try to use this client credentials and authorization code grant. In my next lectures, I'm going to show you an authorization server. Okay. Now you understood all this. Let me tell you a bigger picture about OAuth in your organizations. In your organizations, you will be having applications like any point platform you want your users of your organization to log in, any point platform, and your organization might be having access to Salesforce, maybe SAP, etc. So, as a employee of the organization, how many usernames and passwords do you remember? Difficult, right? So, what you want is you want to log into any of the application within your organization using a single username and password, right? So, actually, what within your organization, there might be an authorization server, and you will create an account whenever you are actually joining your organization or etc. You'll be creating an account with authorization server. So all the employees within your organization will be having an account with authorization server. Now, this authorization server, for this authorization server, these applications like Anypoint Platform, Salesforce, SAP, these all are clients. Okay, these all are clients. Now, actually, what the administrator can do is, administrator in my organization, they will add this Anypoint platform as a client, Salesforce as a client, SAP as a client. Okay. Every application will have its own client ID and secret. Now, whenever a user tries to log in to Anypoint platform, the Anypoint platform, what it will do, it will redirect you to the authorization server. You will give your credentials to authorization server. And if the credentials are correct, the authorization server will redirect to Anypoint platform. And this Anypoint platform will get authorization code. Using authorization code, it will get the access token. And using that access token, it will retrieve the user details and let the user log in. Similarly, for Salesforce, Salesforce is also a client within your organization to this authorization server. So you'll be able to log in to Salesforce or SAP or any application within your organization using same credentials with whatever you registered with authorization server. Don't you think that this is single sign-on? Yes. Using single sign-on, sign-in, using single username and password, you will be able to sign into any of the applications within your organization. So one of the purposes of authorization server is single sign-on, right? So now in this video, you understood about OAuth. Actually, OAuth is a little bit different if we use a token type called as JWT tokens. So what is this JWT token and what is its role in OAuth? Very important discussion. I will discuss it in our next video. Okay, I'll see you next video.